By the end of 1944 and the first months of 1945, the once invincible German war machine found itself teetering on the precipice of utter collapse. The Wehrmacht was suffering a crushing defeat on the Eastern Front, while an increasingly untenable situation was building up in the West. This period marked the beginning of desperation for the last soldiers of the Wehrmacht, as their once vaunted forces were hurled back into a devastated Reich and ordered to wage an unprecedented war of attrition against an overwhelming foe. The strategic initiative had changed, and the German military, battered and depleted, shifted from a relentless offensive campaign in Europe to a battle for survival on its own soil. The Eastern Front was a theatre of unimaginable ferocity and relentless retreat. Across a huge front line, German forces streamed back westwards towards the river Oder, the last bastion of defence before Berlin. This river line represented Germany's final, desperate attempt to shield its capital from the advancing Red Army. Along this 200-mile front, Hitler's forces were tasked to fight colossal, bloodthirsty battles in a desperate attempt to hold the disintegrating front. These were not battles for strategic advantage, but rather desperate, often suicidal stands where units fought until they either ran out of ammunition or were killed. The fighting was frequently characterized by brutal, close-quarter engagements that stretched for days, with both sides suffering horrific casualties. Even the elite Waffen-SS, lauded for their fanatical determination, found themselves shuttled from crisis point to crisis point as the German armies struggled to hold back the overwhelming weight of numbers on the Allied side. Their reputation for steadfastness could do little to alter the inevitable tide of overwhelming enemy superiority. The dire military situation was made worse by a catastrophic depletion of resources. Ammunition and fuel were in a critical state of supply, and reserves in some units were almost non-existent. This logistical nightmare meant that even if Germany could still produce advanced weaponry, its ability to deploy and sustain these assets in combat was severely compromised. The shortage of fuel was particularly crippling, proving to be the trickiest problem for the German forces. This reality was graphically illustrated as retreating Germans were forced to abandon hundreds of vehicles which had become bogged down in mud or had simply run out of fuel, littering the battlefields with useless machines. German divisions, once formidable, were often under strength, often by as much as 50%, and equipped with a mix of weapons, a testament to the desperate measures taken to maintain even a semblance of a fighting force. Adding to these internal weaknesses was the sheer crushing numerical superiority of the Allied and Soviet forces. On the Eastern Front, where the majority of Germany's remaining strength was concentrated, the Soviet offensive was a juggernaut of endless columns of tanks, self-propelled guns, and other tracked vehicles moving forward. Major Soviet operations were ruthless and tore through the German defenses effortlessly. The German High Command, despite Hitler's fervent denials, was well aware of the strength of the Red Army and the numerical superiority of Soviet armor and air power. These overwhelming odds fostered a pervasive atmosphere of impending downfall throughout Germany, especially in Berlin, which had already been reduced to rubble by bombing raids. Amidst this collapsing reality, the German leadership, particularly Adolf Hitler, remained mired in a catastrophic delusion. His refusal to acknowledge the consequences of his own actions, stemming from a perverse will to self-destruction, directly condemned his remaining soldiers to a desperate and often futile struggle. He continued to insist on fanatical aggression and resistance, even as the Reich crumbled around him, which meant simply sending soldiers to their death. While determined rearguard actions were fought to cover the withdrawal, costing the Soviets many hundreds of tanks, these were mere delaying tactics in a war already lost. The inability of the German leadership to adapt to the grim realities of the battlefield led to catastrophic decisions, further depleting manpower and resources that could no longer be replaced. The last soldiers of the Wehrmacht were thus caught in a tragic paradox, fighting with unyielding resolve, born of desperation and indoctrination, yet for a cause that was increasingly, undeniably, and sadly lost. The Volksgrenadier divisions, too few, too late. In the autumn of 1944, Hitler ordered the creation of a new type of German infantry division. It was meant as a direct response to the catastrophic manpower and material losses suffered by the Wehrmacht during the Soviet offensive in the east and the Allied advances in Normandy in the west. These new formations were designed to economize on personnel while simultaneously attempting to boost morale through their evocative name, combining the word Volk, meaning people, and Grenadier, which made reference to a traditional elite infantry unit of Imperial Germany. Unlike the completely civilian Volkssturm militia, Volksgrenadier divisions were still professional military formations, albeit tailored to the desperate realities of late-war Germany. Their formation involved a significant reorganization of the traditional German infantry division structure. Older infantry divisions typically comprised 9-line infantry battalions, 3 per regiment. Volksgrenadier divisions, however, were streamlined to just 6-line infantry battalions, organized into 3 2-battalion infantry regiments. To compensate for this reduced manpower, the divisions were intended to have a higher proportion of automatic weapons, such as submachine guns, light machine guns, and, crucially, the new Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifle, a radical departure from the standard bolt-action rifles. They also received increased allocations of infantry anti-tank weapons like the single-shot Panzerfaust and the Panzerschreck rocket launcher, optimizing them for short-range defensive firepower. Artillery organization was also adjusted with larger 6-gun batteries designed to conserve skilled artillery specialists, though overall heavy artillery might be reduced. Supporting elements included a 4-battalion artillery regiment, a combat engineer battalion, an anti-tank battalion, a signals battalion, and often a bicycle-mounted fusilier company for mobility and reconnaissance. The composition of these divisions was highly varied, which resulted in a mixed performance. They were typically formed around a small group of hardened veteran soldiers, non-commissioned officers, and experienced officers, survivors from divisions shattered in previous campaigns. This veteran corps was then filled with a wide array of new conscripts, including older men and younger boys, as well as personnel from the Navy and the Luftwaffe, who were now redundant in their original roles. The quality of these divisions therefore varied considerably depending on the size and experience of their veteran cadre, and the amount of time they had for training and integration before being thrown into combat. Some Volksgrenadier divisions, particularly those with a stronger veteran corps and a higher proportion of former Luftwaffe or Kriegsmarine personnel, performed reasonably well. For instance, the 272nd Volksgrenadier Division, active from September 1944 to April 1945, fought effectively in the Hürtgen Forest and even managed to encircle a US battalion in one engagement, partly due to its veteran commanders. The 212th Volksgrenadier Division, reconstituted from the remnants of the 212th Infantry Division, was rated as one of the best by its corps commander and saw significant action in the Ardennes, successfully making breakthroughs. However, the weaknesses of the Volksgrenadier divisions were often pronounced. Despite the intention to equip them with enough automatic weapons, supply shortages meant that not all units received their full complement of Sturmgewehr 44s, and older, even World War I vintage, weapons like the MGO 8/15 machine gun were sometimes issued. A universal weakness was the chronic lack of motorization. They relied heavily on horses and bicycles for transport, severely limiting their strategic mobility and resupply capabilities, especially during offensive operations or rapid retreats. Many newly raised divisions lacked even full basic training, and their manpower levels often fell below authorized strength shortly after formation due to rapid attrition. This limited training and varied composition meant that while some units could hold their ground effectively in defensive roles, very few Volksgrenadier divisions were rated as capable of sustained offensive actions by late 1944. Allied intelligence often described them as second-rate, bottom-of-the-barrel troops, a perception that reflected their overall limitations despite instances of fierce, often suicidal resistance. The Ardennes Offensive, the last German offensive campaign. On 16th December 1944, Hitler launched a major offensive in the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. 800 kilometers to the west of the Vistula River in Poland, committing most of his available mechanized forces in an effort to knock the Western Allies out of Europe before the next Soviet blow fell in the east. The 5th Panzer Army and 6th SS Panzer Army, supported on the flanks by 2 infantry armies, attempted to rush through the region and seize the Meuse River bridges dividing the Allied front. In weeks of desperate fighting, the German offensive fell short of its goal, halted by a combination of skillful armoured manoeuvres, stubbornly held road junctions, and, when the skies cleared, overwhelming Allied tactical air power. Driving ever deeper into the Ardennes in order to secure the bridgeheads west of the Meuse, the Allied line had begun to resemble an enormous swelling shape or bulge. For this reason, the battle that ensued is famously named the Battle of the Bulge. December 23rd saw the weather begin to clear, which allowed the Allies to drop ammunition and other supplies, including food, medicine, and blankets, to the besieged troops. From the air, the Allies bombed the German supply lines as P-47 Thunderbolts attacked the Germans who were traveling on the roads. Brought in by military glider, a team of volunteer surgeons turned a tool room into an operating center. Somehow the Americans were managing to hold on to the perimeter, and the Germans, lacking enough soldiers, decided to attack individual sites on the west side of the perimeter instead of assaulting simultaneously on all sides. Initially, the tanks were able to break the American line, but as the tide turned, the Germans were beaten and their tanks destroyed. But despite their numerical superiority, the Americans struggled to hold their ground solely thanks to how hard the Germans fought. On Christmas Eve Day, the Germans had penetrated 65 miles into the Allied lines. General Montgomery brought his reserves south in order to stop the Germans on the River Meuse, while General Omar Bradley, who was in charge of the forces south of the German wedge, sent troops to the Belgian city of Bastogne. As the weather cleared, 5,000 Allied aircraft sent bombs to strafe the German supply lines. A German advance was stopped before reaching the Meuse, and the bridges at Dinant, Givet, and Namur, which had been held by the British, were about to be taken over by the Americans. Because they had advanced faster than their supply lines, the Germans faced the dire situation of critical shortages of fuel and ammunition. The German officers realized the crisis, and General Hasso von Manteuffel recommended a withdrawal back to the western rampart and a halt to all offensive operations. As was usual, Hitler rejected the request. On Christmas Eve, the United States 2nd Armored Division had tried to cut off the 2nd Panzer Division's spearheads at the Meuse. At the same time, the 4th Cavalry Group occupied the 9th Panzer Division at Marche. Overwhelmed, these panzer divisions tried to break free twice, but were only partly successful and lost much of their equipment in the effort. Realizing that the Allies were getting stronger, not weaker, the Germans could see that there was no possibility of continuing any offensive action toward the Meuse. Patton's forces had been able to break the siege of Bastogne on December 26th. The cold weather that had characterized December in the Ardennes continued. Because of the frigid temperatures in January, the trucks had to run their engines every half hour in order to keep the oil from congealing. But the new year brought a decidedly more promising start for the Allies, although the Germans began 1945 aggressively by launching 2 new operations. Operation Baseplate got underway at 9:15 a.m. on January 1st, as the Luftwaffe attacked Allied airfields in the Low Countries, damaging or destroying nearly 500 aircraft. But the Luftwaffe paid for their efforts, losing 277 planes. Of those losses, 172 were because the Allies had established an unusually high number of flak guns to protect against the German V-1 flying bomb and missile attacks. Friendly fire from German flak guns that had not been alerted to the air attack also contributed to German losses. At one airfield, the Germans lost 40 of their planes but damaged only 4 American planes. The Germans could ill afford such losses, and these ones rendered the Luftwaffe ineffective for the remaining months of the war. The second attack, launched by German Army Group G and Army Group Upper Rhine, was sent against the 70-mile line of the 7th U.S. Army. stretched thin because Eisenhower had ordered the 7th Army to reinforce the American forces at the Ardennes. The loss of troops, supplies, and equipment weakened the unit. Operation North Wind, which deliberately set to attack the thinly stretched line, would be the last major German offensive on the Western Front. Supreme Commander Eisenhower wanted General Montgomery to go on the counteroffensive on January 1st, with the aim of meeting up with Patton's advancing Third Army and cutting off most of the attacking Germans, trapping them in a pocket. It was snowing. Montgomery would not risk his unprepared infantry troops for an area of no strategic importance during a snowstorm, and didn't attack until January 3rd. By that time, a number of Germans had managed to fall back successfully. However, in doing so, they lost most of their heavy equipment. When the offensive got underway, the 1st and 3rd US armies were separated by approximately 25 miles. On January 2nd, German tanks were able to knock out 15 of the American Sherman tanks. Most of the German forces were able to withdraw successfully and escape. Once again, however, they were not able to take their equipment with them. This time, it was due to the lack of fuel. On January 7, 1945, Hitler finally agreed to withdraw all forces from the Ardennes, including the SS Panzer divisions, thus ending all offensive operations. In order to avoid having the forces that they had driven into the Allied front cut off, the Germans had no choice but to withdraw over the course of January 8th through 16th, 1945. It had caused much damage, but it had drained the Germans of their strength, preventing them from a sustained resistance. The German 1st, 3rd and 7th Armies had 17,000 soldiers sent to the hospital because of the cold weather. January 25th brought an end to the last major German offensive of World War II. Fighting for Hungary, the Soviet siege of Budapest. Initially, the Soviet operations in Hungary were only a distraction, with the objective of drawing off German forces from Poland. But in time, as the Red Army became aware that they could in fact take Budapest, and because of the fierce resistance by the Wehrmacht, the operation changed completely. In late December 1944, Marshal Rodion Malinovsky's 2nd Ukrainian Front and Marshal Fyodor Tolbukin's 3rd Ukrainian Front had renewed their offensive, penetrated the imposing German Margareith defences located between Lake Balaton and the southern outskirts of the capital, and encircled 3 SS divisions, the 13th Panzer Division and numerous Hungarian units in the city itself. The task of capturing the city was no mean task, and initial Soviet attacks into Budapest itself vividly demonstrated that seizure of the city would require considerable time and effort. To do so, Malinovsky created a new group consisting of 3 rifle corps of the 46th Army to reduce Buda, while ordering the 18th Separate Guards Rifle Corps, 7th Romanian Corps, and 30th Rifle Corps from 7th Guards Army to seize Pest. This loose organization under dual army command made little progress in the last days of December. There were not many veterans of city fighting at Stalingrad in those units, and the Germans did an excellent job organizing a defense. Moreover, the commitment of large forces to reduce German defenses in the city weakened the Soviet outer encirclement line 40 kilometers or 30 miles west of Buda, and provided an opportunity for the Germans to mount a relief effort for their beleaguered garrison. On Christmas Day, Hitler responded to the southern threat and attempted to exploit the relief opportunity by directing the redeployment of his 4th SS Panzer Corps from the area north of Warsaw to Hungary. This was exactly what the Soviets were looking for. 2 full-strength SS Panzer divisions, nicknamed Totenkopf and Viking, detrained northwest of Budapest and launched a surprise night attack on New Year's Day, hitting the 4th Guards Army of Tolbukin on its vulnerable western flank just south of the Danube River. The violent attack, which nearly destroyed the Soviet 18th Tank Corps, finally ground to a halt only 20 kilometers west of Budapest, blocked by redeployed reserves from both 46th and 4th Guards armies. On 6th January, a counterattack by Colonel General Andrei Kravchenko's 6th Guards Tank Army and the 7th Guards Army jumped off north of the Danube in an effort to encircle the attackers, but made little headway. A second German attack was launched by the 3rd Panzer Corps north of Székesfehérvár on 7th January. Designed to take advantage of the 4th SS Panzer Corps' success to the north, it was halted by Soviet Fourth Guards army forces with only limited gains. This assault, however, demonstrated that Soviet defences southwest of Budapest were relatively weak and perhaps could be crumbled by a larger German force. The news were well received by Hitler in his headquarters, and he decided that it was time to hit the Soviets with everything they had near Budapest. After conducting one more lunge towards Budapest from the northwest, which again alarmed the Soviets and drew more forces to the region, the 4th SS Panzer Corps redeployed to the Székesfehérvár area and launched a renewed attack eastward together with the 3rd Panzer Corps on 18 January. This attack was initially successful, but Marshal Malinowski managed to carefully position his units so that the shock of the German attack was gradually absorbed. After a final German attempt to drive through to the city, German forces began withdrawing to their initial positions on 27 January. Despite all their efforts, breaking the siege of Budapest had become an enormously difficult task. Meanwhile, Soviet troops continued to inch forward into the city of Pest. On 10 January, the Soviet High Command urged Malinowski to establish more centralized control over the 3 corps involved, and the next day Malinowski formally appointed Major General Ivan Mikhailovich Afonin, commander of 18th Guards Rifle Corps, to head the Budapest operational group. Afonin launched an attack to split Pest in two, reaching the Danube River by 14 January. In a world of snow and mist, Soviet assault squads and German defenders fought out a deadly battle, block by block. As the defenders ran short of fuel and ammunition, their tanks and other heavy weapons gradually fell silent. On 12 January, the Soviets seized the racetrack that had served as the last emergency landing strip for Ju-52 resupply aircraft. By 17 January, the remaining German defenders fell back to the river, only to find that the Soviets had used the sewers to reach the bank ahead of them. At least half of the 9th SS Mountain Corps ceased to exist. More than 36,000 Germans had died, and 63,000 had surrendered by the 18th of January. The misery of the remaining German defenders would continue west of the river in Buda. Both sides continued to suffer heavy casualties, and it is claimed that the Battle of Budapest was close to the Battle of Stalingrad in its ferocity. The struggle went on until 12 February, when about half of the remaining German garrison of 26,000 men attempted to break out. In bloody, desperate fighting, the force was destroyed, and on the following day, Buda fell. Loss of the city, however, would not end Hitler's fixation on operations in Hungary, to the detriment of operations elsewhere. The fight for the capital of Hungary ended in a crushing defeat for Hitler and his Wehrmacht, but more than that. Soviet-German combat in Hungary throughout December 1944 and January 1945 served a crucial strategic purpose by keeping Hitler's attention in the south rather than focusing on the east. This had been the original objective of the Soviets, to force Hitler to divest his troops, tanks and fighting effort from Poland to Hungary. Operation Spring Awakening, a desperate effort to stop the Red Army. The second half of 1944 had seen disaster after disaster for Hitler on the Eastern Front. Most of his East European allies had either been overrun by the Soviets or had changed sides and were now fighting against him. Hitler was determined to reverse the dire situation in the East and chose his Waffen-SS divisions to be the spearhead of what was to be the last German offensive of World War II. However, the weather and Hitler's ludicrously inflated expectations combined to turn the attack into a rout. Operation Spring Awakening was named after the expectations that Hitler had for the rest of 1945. That once the winter was over, the German Wehrmacht would recover ground and the world would finally wake up to the might of the German army. Instead, it signified the loss of precious manpower and territory. It took place in Western Hungary on the Eastern Front and lasted from 6th March until 15th March 1945. The objective was to secure the last significant oil reserves still available to the European Axis powers and prevent the Red Army from advancing towards Vienna. Ultimately, the Germans failed both their objectives. The operation, initially planned for 5th March, began after German units were moved in great secrecy to the Lake Balaton area in Austria. Many German units were involved, including the 6th Panzer Army and its subordinate Waffen-SS divisions after being withdrawn from the failed Ardennes offensive on the Western Front. On the 26th of December, the 4th SS Panzer Corps was diverted from its positions around Warsaw in an attempt to burst through the Soviet positions around the north of Budapest and relive the beleaguered city. The attack was a total failure, with the Red Army's own counterattack forcing the Germans onto the defensive. The German garrison in the capital held back all Soviet attempts to drive them out of the city, but the end was inevitable. A breakout from the Hungarian capital was authorized on the 11th of February 1945. The city garrison, some 70,000 men strong, was split into 3 assault groups in an attempt to drive through to the west. The Soviets anticipated the move and opened up with all their artillery and rocket launchers on the forces attempting to escape. The badly shaken German and Hungarian units were then mopped up by the Red Army. Of the 70,000 men who attempted to escape the city, only 790 reached German lines. 9 entire German divisions had ceased to exist. It was a complete massacre. Once Budapest had been taken, a considerable number of Soviet divisions were then released to take part in a new offensive aimed at capturing the German-held oil fields at Nagy Kanizsa. This was now one of the very few sources of fuel left to Hitler's rapidly contracting Third Reich, and their loss would be catastrophic. Only 80 kilometers, or 50 miles, separated the Soviets from the vital oil fields, and Hitler decided that only a powerful new offensive could be counted upon to throw the Soviets back over the river Danube, stabilize the situation in Hungary, and defend the approaches to Vienna. Hitler decided that only a powerful new offensive could be counted upon to throw the Soviets back. It was his only chance. It was at this point that Hitler named this new operation Spring Awakening. He decided to entrust the operation to his finest remaining divisions and thus ordered the removal of the 6th SS Panzer Army from the Ardennes front for immediate transfer to the east. The move, at Hitler's insistence, was to take place in absolute secrecy. All identifying insignia were to be removed from uniforms and vehicles. All units were given cover names, and corps headquarters were not permitted to become operational until their constituent divisions were in place. The measures became ludicrous. For example, the commander of the 6th SS Panzer Army, SS Group General Sepp Dietrich, was not permitted to enter the operational area until just before the offensive was launched for fear his presence might be detected by Soviet spies. Hitler's plan involved a combined attack by Army Group South and Army Group Southeast. General Wöhler's Army Group South, comprising the 6th SS Panzer Army, 6th Army, 8th Army and the Hungarian 3rd Army, would strike south between Lake Balaton and Lake Velens, while Army Group Southeast with the 2nd Panzer Army would attack from west of the Soviet lines. It was hoped that Marshal Tolbukin's 3rd Ukrainian Front would thus be crushed. The Germans had good reason to expect the ground in this region to be frozen solid in early March. However, the spring thaws had come much earlier than normal, and the usual iron-hard ground was instead a soft, boggy morass. Into this sea of glutinous mud, Dietrich's heavy panzers would sink all the way up to their axles and even, in a few extreme cases, all the way up to their turrets. On the opening day of the offensive, 6th March, snow began to fall, further worsening the already atrocious ground conditions. To preserve the element of surprise and not knowing that the Soviets were well aware of the coming attack, some Waffen-SS Grenadiers had been dropped off as much as 18 kilometers or 11 miles from their start points, lest the sound of their trucks alert the enemy to their presence. By the time the SS troopers reached the launch point for their attack, they were already soaking wet, freezing and exhausted. Many did not reach the start line in time. This was disastrous, as with no powerful and immediate infantry attack to follow the barrage from the German artillery, the Soviets had ample time to recover. In several cases, the armored support for the Waffen-SS troops had become so hopelessly bogged down in the German rear that the infantry were forced to launch their attacks without it, and suffered horrendous casualties as a result. Despite their problems, the Waffen-SS troops threw themselves into battle with their customary ardor. But these Waffen-SS divisions were no longer the mighty formations of 2 years before. Combat attrition had cost them many of their best troops, and the quality of the replacements they received could not hope to match that of those they had lost. Nevertheless, even the greenest of the inadequately trained replacements were aware of the combat reputations of the divisions in which they now served, and gave their utmost in the uneven battle which developed. Unfortunately, such enthusiasm counted for little against the well-equipped and highly professional Red Army units. Soviet counterattacks were launched almost immediately. German losses suffered in successfully beating these off left them too weak to press forward again as planned. However, by 11th March, the town of Simontornia near Lake Balaton had been captured and a bridgehead established over the Sayo Canal, one of the initial objectives for 1st SS Panzer Corps. German units were already feeling the effects of shortages of fuel and ammunition, though, and had suffered crippling losses in men and tanks. Although the Germans had maintained a forward momentum, they were now slowing drastically as Soviet resistance intensified. By mid-March, the 6th SS Panzer Army had only around 200 tanks and self-propelled guns still operational, prompting General Dietrich to ask, without success, that the offensive be halted. It all ended in a catastrophic loss for Germany, and with the Red Army taking Vienna. The city fell on the 13th of April. Desperate times call for desperate measures, the tragedy of Demmin. By April 1945, the Wehrmacht was sustaining losses in practically all fronts. As the Soviet army rapidly advanced in German territory, Hitler decided to divulge a message to the population through his Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels. The message was clear: resist until the last breath. Do not flee, do not yield, and do not surrender. Every German needed to stop the Red Army in their towns or die trying. This direct order from the Führer brought tragic consequences for the civilian population of the Third Reich. Some people were fanatics of the Nazi cause, and they gladly took to defending their country against a professional army of Soviet soldiers. But by that time, most of the population was already aware of the mistakes that were made in the war, and for them, Hitler's message meant to brace themselves and expect the worst to happen. In the closing days of April 1945, as the relentless advance of the Red Army drew perilously close to Pomeranian towns such as Demmin, a telling pattern of abandonment began to unfold. The party and state officials, who had been demanding unwavering resistance from their fellow Germans, were among the first to desert their posts and flee the approaching Soviet forces. This act of disloyalty was soon mirrored by the Wehrmacht units stationed in and around Demmin. Despite having pledged an oath of unwavering loyalty to Hitler, vowing a heroic downfall rather than surrender or retreat, these military units also hastily evacuated the city. Their departure was marked by a destructive act that sealed the fate of many. They demolished the bridges spanning the Peene River and its tributaries, the Trebel and Tolenzi. This decision had dire and immediate consequences for the population left behind, as their potential escape route to the west was now irrevocably cut off. Residents who had not departed earlier, along with hundreds of refugees, found themselves trapped, facing the daunting prospect of the Red Army's arrival with profound fear and no means of escape. This pervasive fear among the trapped population was deeply rooted in the grim reality of the war. Many had, through various channels, become acutely aware of the extensive atrocities committed by the Wehrmacht and the SS in the occupied territories of the Soviet Union. The widespread knowledge of these past actions fueled a terrifying expectation of severe retribution. On 30th April, the same day when Hitler took his own life, the tranquility of Demmin was soon shattered by the distant rumble of artillery, growing steadily louder, accompanied by the menacing sounds of approaching tanks. As the Soviet forces drew nearer, residents and refugees in Demmin desperately sought shelter in basements, hoping to find a measure of safety from the impending storm. In a desperate attempt to deter potential violence, many women resorted to blackening their faces with ashes and wrapping their heads in torn bandages, striving to appear as unattractive as possible. A few brave citizens, risking severe repercussions from any remaining Nazi loyalists, displayed white sheets and towels from their windows, signaling the city's intention to surrender without a fight. Before noon, a vanguard consisting of 2 Soviet tank brigades reached the southern outskirts of Demmin, only to find their planned route towards Rostock blocked by the thoroughly destroyed bridges. This forced them to halt their rapid advance. By midday, a significant number of Soviet tanks and other military vehicles had converged, backing up into the city's historic center. By afternoon, after just 2 brief exchanges of gunfire, Demmin was entirely under the control of Soviet troops. Tragically, before the soldiers even fully entered the city, 21 of its residents had already chosen to end their own lives. The closely clustered beam and mortar houses of Demmin's historic center provided ample fuel for the flames, which raged uncontrollably for several days, ultimately leading to the widespread destruction of the old city. Yet the devastation caused by fire was overshadowed by the profound terror inflicted by marauding and often intoxicated Red Army soldiers. Hundreds of women and girls were subjected to brutal assaults. A significant number of residents were murdered and countless dwellings were systematically plundered. The cumulative effect of these horrors, coupled with the despair of being trapped, culminated in an act of mass suicide on a scale that surpassed anything witnessed in other German cities and towns during the final days of the war. A collective panic seemed to seize the city's population, leading to entire families choosing to end their lives. Among the victims were individuals of all ages and social strata: infants and small children, school-aged youth and adolescents, young men and women, affluent couples, pensioners, and the very elderly. The backgrounds, careers, and social status of those who committed suicide showed no discernible pattern, indicating the indiscriminate nature of the despair. In addition to hundreds of people from Demmin and the surrounding area, the dead included hundreds of refugees who had sought safety there from regions like Pomerania, East and West Prussia. The methods employed by those who chose to take their own lives varied, reflecting the desperate circumstances. Some ingested poison, while others used firearms to put a bullet in their brain. There were instances of individuals slitting their wrists or hanging themselves. However, the most prevalent method, particularly among women and children, was drowning. Women would fill knapsacks with rocks, tie their children's hands to their own at the wrists, and wade into the waters of the Peene and its tributaries. For weeks afterward, corpses continued to surface in the rivers, a grim testament to the tragedy. Estimates regarding the precise number of suicides in Demmin differ. An improvised registry compiled the names of 612 people, of whom 400 were recorded as having killed themselves. By November 1945, the Regional Council for the Demmin area estimated the number of deaths from these collective self-eliminations to be between 700 and 1,000. This is just an example of what happened to a German town when the Wehrmacht refused to fulfill their duty of protecting the civilians. After Budapest, Berlin and Vienna, the fall of Prague, the fall of Berlin at the start of May did not end the fighting. With victory in sight, Stalin and his senior commanders became more concerned than ever about the possibility that the Western Allies would play them false. At the time and long afterward, the Soviet participants took seriously the German offer to surrender to the West while continuing to fight in the East. Of course, Eisenhower insisted on total surrender on all fronts, but the Soviet leaders could not overcome their fear of treachery or, at the very least, of being cheated out of their hard-won victory. Thus, when American General Omar Bradley offered to assist in the occupation of Czechoslovakia, Stalin responded with another order to accelerate the advance. On 1st May, the Soviet High Command ordered 1st Belarusian Front to relieve all elements of 1st Ukrainian Front engaged in mopping up in Berlin so that General Konev could turn southwest and advance on Prague. The Soviets' old nemesis, the German Army Group Center, which for over 2 years had been poised threateningly on the approaches to Moscow, would become the new and last Soviet target. In May 1945, the more than 600,000 men of this army group, now commanded by Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, awaited inevitable destruction in Czechoslovakia, which had been one of the first countries Hitler invaded. While the Reichstag was still under assault between 1st and 6th May, the Soviet forces regrouped in Czechoslovakia to launch an offensive of overwhelming proportions against Schörner's force. This attack was in conjunction, if not in competition, with General George S. Patton's U.S. Third Army, which was poised to enter Czechoslovakia from Bavaria. The combined force of over 2 million Soviet and Polish soldiers planned to rely on heavy tank forces, including 3 tank armies and a cavalry mechanized group, to spearhead a rapid thrust directly on the Czech capital, Prague. General Konev's hastily approved plan consisted in an attack west of Dresden, penetrating the Erzgebirge mountain passes in southeast Germany, and assisting the divisions already stationed in the area for a rapid exploitation to Prague. Polish and Soviet forces would launch a supporting attack. Simultaneously, in a wide arc covering the eastern and southern borders of Czechoslovakia, similar offensives would be mounted, spearheaded by tank forces. The advance was to begin on 7th May, but at noon on 5th May, the population of Prague launched an uprising and appealed by radio for Allied help. This brief struggle with the German occupation forces cost the Czechs at least 3,000 killed and 10,000 wounded. Stalin again hurried the attack and ordered that it commence on the afternoon of the 6th of May. Spurred on by Stalin's demands for haste and taking advantage of local German withdrawals, Konev struck from the north on 6th May. He launched his main attack from the Riesa area with 3 combined arms armies and 2 Guards tank armies. The next day, he launched 2 secondary attacks with slightly smaller forces further to the east. The Second Ukrainian Front struck northward from Brno toward Olomouc and Prague with 4 combined arms armies. Within 2 days, Konev's forces occupied Dresden, Bautzen and Gorlitz against dwindling German resistance, and the 4th Ukrainian Front seized a town called Olomouc. A day later, it linked up with advancing 2nd Ukrainian Front forces for a combined drive on Prague. To accelerate his advance on the night between 8th and 9th May, Konev ordered 2 tank armies to make a dash for Prague. At first light, the 2 tank armies, spearheaded by specially tailored forward detachments, began an 80-kilometer race, linking up in the city with forward mobile elements of 2nd and 4th Ukrainian fronts, which included Czech forces of the 1st Separate Czech Tank Brigade. During the following 2 days, Soviet forces liquidated or accepted the surrender of more than 600,000 remaining German forces. On the 11th of May, advanced elements of the 4th Tank Army linked up with the forces of the U.S. Third Army east of Pilsen, ending the major wartime field operations of the Red Army. By early May, with Hitler dead and the Third Reich crumbling, the surviving German military leaders were more than ready to comply with Allied demands for general and unconditional surrender. Eisenhower's threat to break off negotiations and seal the front lines against refugees, in essence turning them over to the Soviets, was the final argument. Yet the Soviet representative to Eisenhower's headquarters, General Lwonne Susloparov, had no instructions on the matter. When his counterpart in Moscow, Major General John Dean, inquired about coordinating the announcement of the surrender, the Soviet staff officers again suspected that their allies were seeking to grab all the credit. Meanwhile, in Reims, the surrender ceremony had been arranged for early on 7th May, and Susloparov still had no instructions. Afraid to sign without orders, he was even more afraid to have the Soviet Union left out of the surrender. Finally, Susloparov found the strength to sign the surrender document, but he made a knot that would allow Moscow to renegotiate later if necessary. Soon after signing, he received a frantic telegram from the Soviet High Command ordering him, "Don't sign any documents." How much stronger was the Red Army compared to the Wehrmacht? While most historians have recognized the scope of Soviet sacrifice and achievement, stereotypes persist as to how the Wehrmacht and the Red Army fought, especially during the latter stages of the war. While the Red Army never slavishly copied the Germans and, in fact, followed its own traditions in matters of organization, tactics, and leadership, it did learn from its more skilled opponent. During wartime, the Red Army built upon its own rich theoretical base and implemented what theorists had ordained but had not been able to realize in the 1930s. Necessity drove that education, and the cost of that education was high. As the war dragged on, the German army came to imitate the tactics of the Red Army, while the Red Army came closer to the essence of the original Blitzkrieg, which they called deep operations. In 1941, the German army prided itself on its mission command tactics, which relied on all leaders understanding the general tactics of their Führer and thus being able to make decisions in a flexible, decentralized manner. In theory, this allowed considerable scope for individual initiative. German army units, particularly the panzer forces, were already famous for their ability to reorganize as required by the situation, to bypass centers of enemy resistance, and to continue the exploitation far into the enemy rear areas. Despite the widespread belief in Nazi racist views, the German commanders, or at least the professional officers at the top, considered themselves to be trusted subordinates of the state and not necessarily agreed with the Nazi Party and its ideology. If the Wehrmacht had a limitation in 1941 and 1942, it was in the area of logistics. The entire scope of the Russian campaign, started in June 1941, was probably beyond German capability from the start, and many of the early German offensives were halted by lack of supplies rather than by Soviet resistance. By contrast, the Red Army in the same years was a product of the Stalinist way, or managing the state. Its troops lacked training and equipment, it did not follow coherent operational and tactical tradition and concepts, and many of the commanders that had been inherited from the Tsarist army had been purged. The German invasion caught the Red Army in transition, without coherent organizations or effective weapons. Commanders tended to ignore the terrain and the enemy situation, deploying their forces evenly across the front and failing to accomplish the most elemental coordination between infantry and artillery. The more unscrupulous political officers second-guessed tactical leaders, and summary execution awaited those officers who failed. Stalin, stunned by the disaster of 1941, did not trust even his few competent generals and attempted to manage the war personally. On occasion, such as in the defense of Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad, Stalin's stubbornness was an asset. At other times, however, his demands to counterattack at the frontiers, to defend Kiev in 1941, or to resume the offensive in May 1942, were based on a complete misunderstanding of the military situation. Even when Soviet arms achieved limited victories during the winter offensives of 1941 and 1942, Stalin was too ambitious, attempting to win the war in one all-out advance instead of a series of cautious offensives. From late 1942 onward, the Wehrmacht began to lose many of its distinctive advantages and to acquire some of the weaknesses of its opponent. Continuous casualties meant a general decline in German training and, therefore, in tactical proficiency. Equipment wore out, and the German economy was no longer able to provide quality weapons in sufficient quantities to maintain the previous technological edge. As for leadership, Adolf Hitler began to resemble the Stalin of 1941. Having been correct to forbid withdrawals during the first Soviet winter offensive, Hitler interfered more and more in operations, both offensive and defensive. Although this interference has been exaggerated in documentaries and books, it is true that the German forces gradually lost the flexibility and subordinate initiative that had made them so successful. A few brilliant commanders were permitted to make their own decisions as late as 1945, but if they failed, they were soon replaced by men too timid to even request the authority to maneuver. Führungsoffiziers, the Nazi equivalent of political commissars, began to appear in German headquarters, and commanders who suffered defeat for any reason were lucky to be left alive. Purges became more common in the German Wehrmacht. Under these circumstances, the German soldiers' principal motivation became simple survival. At the tactical level, only the most fanatical Nazis had any faith in ultimate victory, but every German feared to surrender to a seemingly inhuman enemy. The Red Army at the same time developed effective leaders, organizations, weapons and tactics, in the process returning to its pre-war concepts of warfare. During the second period of war, from late 1942 through 1943, the Red Army blossomed into a force that not only could halt the fabled Blitzkrieg offensive, but could also conduct its own offensives in all types of weather and terrain. German accounts of overwhelming Soviet forces are really a tribute to the Soviet ability to deceive their opponents and concentrate all available forces on a narrow frontage at an unpredictable point. As a result, the Red Army was able to decimate the Wehrmacht, establishing the overall numerical superiority that characterized the last 2 years of the war. Even then, however, Soviet manpower was not inexhaustible, and the Soviet commanders increasingly attempted to avoid expensive frontal assaults whenever possible. Of course, Red Army commanders continued to make costly mistakes as late as the Battle of Berlin, but the officer corps became steadily more competent and trusted. Communist ideology was, in large measure, supplanted by patriotism and by the daily demands of the struggle. Political officers confined themselves to matters of morale and propaganda, and even Stalin began to trust his subordinates as professional experts. The all-powerful centralized Soviet High Command gave way to separate front or multi-front headquarters, and finally to decentralized authority throughout the chain of command. It is true that during the last few campaigns of 1945, Stalin inserted himself as overall field commander in order to preserve his political status. Yet even this action was a vote of confidence in his officers. Except for key political, strategic and operational decisions, Stalin could and did leave the organization of these campaigns and operations to the front commanders and their staffs. He had enough faith in the Red Army to allow it to conclude the war, knowing that his own prestige would only be enhanced by his superbly competent subordinates. These subordinates had developed their own procedures and techniques for conducting mechanized warfare on a massive scale, which was what really defeated the Wehrmacht in Vienna, Prague, and the Ardennes. By 1944, the typical Soviet offensive was preceded by careful planning and deception measures designed to concentrate forces at the designated breakthrough point. The attack began with a wave of reconnaissance battalions that infiltrated the German defenses and seized key positions, thereby rendering the rest of the German positions untenable. This infiltration was accompanied or followed by massive, carefully orchestrated air and artillery offensives. When the whirlwinds of artillery fire shifted from the front lines toward the German rear areas, infantry, heavy armor and engineers conducted the conventional assault to eliminate the remaining centers of German resistance. As quickly as possible, senior Soviet commanders committed their mobile forces through the resulting gaps. Although the tank armies and separate mobile corps were large formations commanded by experienced general officers, much of their tactical success depended on the work of the young captains and majors who commanded the leading forward detachments. These highly mobile combined arms groups of 800 to 2,000 soldiers avoided pitched battle whenever possible, bypassing German defenders in order to establish large encirclements and seize the bridgeheads for the next offensive. Follow-on rifle forces, supported by the increasingly powerful Red Air Force, then reduced the German encirclements while the mobile forces continued their exploitation. Throughout these offensives, the rear services performed prodigious feats of improvisation to keep the spearheads supplied even 400 kilometers behind enemy lines. Just as in the German offensives of 1941 and 1942, the later Soviet attacks were often halted by logistical overextension rather than by enemy action. Thus, it was in June 1941, when Operation Barbarossa started, that the universally recognized irresistible force of the Wehrmacht began to change on account of meeting the seemingly immovable Red Army. In 4 years of combat, which consumed immense resources and energy, the Red Army survived and prevailed. In a struggle whose effects Stalin later likened to an atomic war, the irresistible force of the Wehrmacht was totally destroyed by May 1945.